gets all the name recognition, but really it was right here in Norwich, as I'm hoping to show you today. I want to give a big shout out of thanks to the Otis Library, especially Julie and Cornell for their help today in setting this up. And I also want to recognize and applaud the Otis Library in the city of Norwich for making this into Harris Sisters Month and really putting the stress where it belongs, which is on African American agency. For those of you who don't know me, I teach at San José State in California. This is the weather we have all year round. Which is why a vacant lot with a burned out house is for sale for $800,000 in the Delaware Beach. So anyway, there's ups and downs to it, but it is certainly nice to be here in spring. Connecticut in spring is a lovely spot. I've been working most of the century on a book on Prudence Crandall and her school. There is now a completed manuscript. I'll be reading some sections of that today, but it is still not published. So stay tuned. I'm sure there will be events in Norwich once that comes out. Okay, so it is really good to be participating in Harris Sisters Month because it's putting the stress, as I said, where it belongs. And that's on the initiative and the intellect of African Americans, the free blacks who lived in the North in the antebellum era. I admire Prudence Crandall, and I admire the other white abolitionists who inaugurated the road that we as white people have to walk on to become anti-racist. But their work can't even get started if it wasn't for the bravery and initiative of African Americans who were willing to find those very few white people with whom they could work. So today I'm going to discuss 10 African Americans from that time period, all of whom have some involvement with Crandall School. The very fact that I can name 10 free blacks, many of them students, therefore young people, young women, is a testimony to what has happened in the last 60 years of scholarship. It is a testimony to everyone from amateur genealogists to those people who are doing work in DNA analysis. Right? It's a very wide swath of scholarship that has made it possible for us to once again tell these stories. And it is always a privilege to be able to do that. The 10 people I'm going to be referring to, I have, I believe, all of their names up here. The principal ones, of course, are the actual Harris family. William Montflora Harris was the father, married to Sally Prentice, and 4 of the children enter into the story today. Their oldest, Charles Harris, Sarah Harris, the oldest of their many daughters. Mary Harris was the 4th child and 3rd daughter, Olive Harris a little bit younger. While we have no records documenting that Olive was a student at the school, I have good reasons to be suspicious that she probably was. We do have documentary evidence of Mary Harris being a student at the school. We also do know, of course, that Sarah Harris was the first African American student and the one who led to the integration of Crandall's first academy. Frederick Olney is a very prominent figure in the history of the school who is not discussed enough on his own merits or even in terms of his history with the school. He was clearly part of the connective tissue that made it possible for the black students to remain in contact with their families and friends, whether in Providence or New York, because he traveled to both places. He also became a teacher and activist himself, and was an agent for the Liberator newspaper. David Ruggles, a name I shouldn't have to do much introduction of in Norwich, was also an important figure, a publisher, writer, highly eclectic intellectual profile. And he was one of the people who introduced resolutions in support of Prudence Crandall at various free black conventions. He had stayed in touch with his family here in the Norwich area and with some of the connections from his childhood. And so he undoubtedly, and we know that he knew Frederick Olney, so he was in touch with what was happening at the school, and he was doing his best from his position in New York City to publicize the importance of the school within the New York City community. What is fascinating to me, and also a little bit worrisome, is that no other Crandall researcher has noted this. It's not as though it's hidden. It's in public documents that scholars have known about for the last 200 years. So it is interesting that it kind of takes a renewed emphasis on the African American contributions to even begin to notice someone as visible as a David Ruggles. Crandall and her students made a visit to Norwich very early on in the history of the school. It was probably their first field trip other than going to church. And that I don't think was accidental. The Harris family, obviously, they had moved up to Canterbury, but they still had many friends and associates here. But this was also the closest urban area that had a large black population. And it was probably a way for Crandall to make sure that her students, who were already under a good deal of abuse from the authorities in Canterbury, including the threat of whipping students who came from out of state, whipping them on their naked body. In fact, that was the first threat made. This was probably a way to bring them into a place where they would feel more comfortable, even if they had never been to Norwich before. And this, to me, shows that anti-racist consciousness at its very incipient stage, where Crandall is recognizing that her students need to have contact with the black community, which was very small in Canterbury, but more substantial here. So they do make a visit here, and one of the few incidents that we have recorded from that is that she visited a church where there were black attendees, and it was almost certainly the second congregational church. And that church had a black sexton. Dale Plummer, who I see is here, he and I have been working on who that sexton might be. And Joseph Q, or I think Qui maybe, it's hard to say, we're not sure of the pronunciation, but his father had been a black soldier during the American Revolution. And so he came from a settled family, albeit one that had had its economic ups and downs, as was very common in that era. But here he was, and he actually got to shake hands with Prudence Crandall. Now that might seem a little patronizing to us now, but at that time there were very few white allies of the black cause who were willing to be seen in public with African Americans, let alone actually touching flesh to flesh. Especially Crandall, who at that point was an unmarried young white woman who was putting herself into this national controversy in which sexual innuendos were constantly hurled at people who were involved in that. And the bogeyman of interracial marriage was always being raised. So for her to actually meet a black official of a church, just person to person, was a very strong sign of how far she had come. So Joseph Coy, again, he's the one we know the least about, but at least it's another name. So all of these different African American people present in Norwich at this key moment, forming the kind of community and connections that could make the school possible. I'll also talk very briefly about an anti-abolitionist attack. I'm just interested, again, I've been working on this book for far too long, but do people know the basics about Crandall School, or any no's to that?
I don't really know a lot about that.
All right, so the basics are that she had a boarding school that was the equivalent of a high school for young women that had been chartered by the town's selectmen up at Canterbury, starting in 1831. It was presumed that she would have white students because no one had ever done anything differently. And she did very well with that school. In 1832, Sarah Harris asked to be admitted. I'm going to talk a lot more about that moment. But Sarah Harris asked to be admitted. Crandall went to her Bible and opened it to, and I have to say, I thought this was probably going to be a very bad piece of luck. She opened it to Ecclesiastes, which is the most pessimistic book of the Bible after Job. It's the one that's given us great slogans like "There's nothing new under the sun," and so anyway, she turned to that and she opened up to a passage that says that the oppressed have no one to stand with them, but that the powerful always have someone to stand with them. And she interpreted that as a message from God saying, oh, well, I should go to the other side. I should stand with the oppressed. So she admitted Sarah Harris. Within a few weeks, white parents started going crazy, saying that they had not sent their daughters to a school in order to conduct a social experiment. Crandall got in touch with William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of The Liberator. She then decided to reopen the school for black women only, and did that at the beginning of 1833. This engendered a good deal of opposition from the white supremacists of the time, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I don't talk about the black law at all, but they actually passed a law making it illegal to harbor out-of-state blacks for purposes of education. Apparently purposes of prostitution or enslavement, that was fine, but education, that was right out. So anyway, that was the legal persecution. The vigilante persecution I'll address a little bit later. The school lasted about 18 months until September 1834, when there was a particularly vicious attack upon the school that left every window broken. Crandall was recently married, and in her husband's name the school was closed. I will also try to get through this talk without talking about her husband. And so anyway, bad marital choice, but she gave up the school at that point. And a lot of people say, oh, well, the school was a failure because it was only around for a year and a half. And a lot of the burden of my book is to prove that it was a resounding success. Think about the best teacher you ever had in your life. Think about the most important educational experience you ever had in your life. My guess is it lasted less than 18 months. Maybe it was your third grade teacher, maybe it was one teacher in your freshman year in college, maybe it was a graduate school class that you took. Education is measured by the success of the people who gain that education, not by how long the institution lasts. And we all know this in our gut, but it's not often stated, because we start, especially in a place like Connecticut, we start to pride ourselves on, well, Yale's been around since 1701, and whatever. And so we start to pride ourselves on how long the institution has survived, but all that shows is that institutions have self-survival characteristics, much like people or animals. They prefer to go on living. But doesn't really mean that the education there is better or worse than anywhere else. So anyway, that's the basic outline of the school. And, okay, you can do it. Come on, machine. Very good. For those of you who haven't been up to Canterbury, that's the museum. And that is the actual house where the school was, and a little bio on Crandall there. Okay, so my basic argument is that the Canterbury School was made possible by Black initiative and foresight at this very great moment in American history, when a very few white people were for the first time able to genuinely listen to and follow an agenda that was set by African Americans. The Canterbury School was not a venture by white idealists, but instead it stemmed directly from the initiative and desire of the free black community for education. And if that was going to happen, blacks needed to locate, vet, and work with stalwart progressives in the white community. And that's what happened right around that moment in the early 1830s. Then you add to that this alliance of black and white was supplemented by gender. Crandall School and the black students who attended were writing an important chapter in women's history, as well as in interracial history. Crandall School and its curriculum was the highest form of education open to women in those days. It was still about 5 years before Mount Holyoke would open the collegiate level to women. And when we say high school, what you should be thinking of here is that the curriculum she was giving them was kind of like the last 2 years of high school or the first year and a half of a community college. It was a bit higher than what we would think of today for when we use the term high school. So what we're seeing here then is that the Canterbury School and the abolitionist movement at that time, from about 1831 to 1840, was really the first intersectional movement in American history. Intersectionality is a term that has been developed mostly by women of color who are feminists in the last 50 years. And what it means is that you always have to take account of different identities. So I can come to you today and I can say, I'm an American, I'm a woman, I'm a lesbian, I'm a professor, I'm middle class, I'm white. I can go through these various identities and they affect me differently depending on what the circumstances are. So I can't assume that they will all be equal to me. And this poem by the great Audre Lorde, and I love her there by the chalkboard, saying women are powerful, but and dangerous, yes, indeed. But this poem from the early 70s is often looked at as one of the touchstones of intersectionality. There are so many roots to the tree of anger that sometimes the branches shatter before they bear. Sitting in Nedics, the women rally before they march, discussing the problematic girls they hire to make them free. An almost white counterman passes a waiting brother to serve them first, and the ladies neither notice nor reject the slighter pleasures of their slavery. But I, who am bound by my mirror as well as my bed, see causes in color as well as sex, and sit here wondering which me will survive all these liberations. So it just, again, she's saying, I'm seeing the privilege that the women who are rallying can hire maids to take care of their children or to clean their house. And at the same time, I can see race working and I can see passing working, and it just, so what she was trying to point out was that it's not so easy as saying that we could prioritize and say women's liberation has to come first or racial liberation has to come first. But in fact, we need to be seeing all of these moving in parallel lines. Beautiful poem, and one of America's, I think, best thinkers of the time, of the 70s through the 90s of the last century. And Crandall School then is, I'm going to call it intersectional because here we have race, sex, race and gender rather, sexuality, not in our contemporary sense of LGBT, although I doubt that was utterly absent, but it certainly wasn't articulated, but in the sense that these were teenage women. These were young women who were sexually mature, and that played a real part in how the school was perceived and how criticisms were made of the school, as well as the idea that these women were getting a higher brand of education than was accessible to a lot of white women at the time. Right? So their age what is going to define their sexuality. And also class. There were some black students who came from a fairly solid middle class background and their parents could afford the tuition, but there were others who had to be on essentially a form of financial aid and do some work around the house to stay there. So all the intersections were there. So, why Norwich? Why is Norwich so important? And I don't need to give you a lesson in your own geography, but obviously Norwich has a valuable position in between being at a place of a river convergence. But in this story, it's also fairly close to Canterbury itself, clearly, and also accessible to New London. One of the few professions that was open to black men where they could actually achieve something in the antebellum era was in seafaring professions. And that's because, quite frankly, when you're out on the ocean and someone needs to hoist a sail, it doesn't much matter if you're black or white. It matters that you get the job done. So a kind of elemental meritocracy was going to rule out at sea. And that was very helpful. It's one of the very few professions where black men could actually do well. And this is, again, that's part of Norwich's importance, is being between those two places for this story. That also meant that some African Americans here had enough money that there was some class mobility, which was not all that common in the black community at that time. the effects of racism, the effects of people who had escaped or been freed from slavery and didn't really have marketable skills in the northern economy. These people were often, there was no class stratification, they were simply all poor. That was not the case here in Norwich. And that, of course, will be vital to Crandall School. One of the questions that she asked Garrison when she formulated this idea of reopening the school for black women only was, are there enough families in the Northeast who could afford this? Right? So she knew that there could be a class issue there. But Norwich is going to provide some of that background. Another advantage to seafaring professions is that it gives you some cosmopolitanism. You actually do get to see the world a little bit, and you get to see that America's particular flavor of racism is not universal. And that, of course, will puncture the claims of the racists who say things like, well, this is just a God-ordained way. It's like, well, no, that's not how they do it in France, it's not how they do it in Haiti, it's not how they do it in, wherever else they travel. So it's not unimportant that William Harris himself came from Haiti originally. That was his birthplace. Now, he got out of there long before the revolution happened in Haiti, but in Haiti there was a large demographic imbalance. There were many, many more blacks than whites, and we know that there was a lot of black organizing long before the Haitian Revolution, so we know that people were talking to each other about the inequalities and injustices of the situation. Okay, so let me go over to the Harris family itself. These are all the children about whom we know, and just going to take a moment to go over them. Oh, some child's artwork, no, don't let that happen. So yeah, William Montflora Harris, originally from Haiti. He lives a good long life, as does his second wife, the one who is the mother of his children. So Charles Harris, the oldest, is the one most associated with Norwich, in that he settles here with his wife, who I'm going to talk about a lot, that being Anne Maria or Mariah Davis. And they run a restaurant here in Norwich for many years and are buried here. So very important character. Sarah Harris, of course, the second oldest, marries George Fairweather, who is a smith and artist in Rhode Island, and she moves over there. She becomes very active in the abolitionist movement. We have evidence that she hosted William Lloyd Garrison and other white abolitionists when they were traveling in Rhode Island. So, and she visited Prudence Crandall a few months before her own death, when Crandall was living in Kansas in the 1870s. So yeah, she made the big trip out to Kansas. Mary Harris is the second Harris daughter who we know attended the school. She marries Penniman Williams. They move to New Orleans, where they are active in the teaching of the freedmen after the Civil War. Their own sons go on to become educators and musicians in New Orleans. And then, in one of those odd twists of fate, the family moves north a couple generations later in the early 20th century, and they are light-skinned enough that they can pass as white. And this lie continued until a man a little bit older than me in his 70s applied for his passport, and when he got his birth certificate, came back black, and he said, oh, there's an error here in my birth certificate. It turned out there was no error. And then the family history all came out. And so it turns out that actually one of Mary Harris's descendants married Cab Calloway, the great jazz musician. And so the white fellow I'm talking about, who grew up thinking that he was white and not black, the one who discovered the passing, he actually met Cab Calloway as a kid, and everyone just called him Uncle Cab, and he didn't know why. So yeah, so remarkable stories there that again chart American history vis-a-vis race. Olive Smith Harris actually does marry Frederick Olney later on. She becomes a teacher in New London. So they too stay right here in the county, so active that way. The last two children we don't know much about biographically. We know they lived long. We know that William Lloyd Garrison Harris lived quite a long life. and stayed in the area. But I point this out just because here we are right in the middle of the school conflict, 1834, and William Harris names his child, repeats the name William, he's already got a William. Probably they called him Lloyd, which is what people called Garrison too. But they have William Lloyd Garrison in 34, and then 2 years later, after the school has gone down, not in flames, but in a lot of broken glass, after the school's gone down, their last child is Mariah Crandall Harris. So connection between the families and respect for what the Crandalls had done for the family is still there. So that is noteworthy for how tight the bonds were between the Harrises and the abolitionist movement. The other thing that now I want to come to with the school is the role of Mariah Davis, the woman who will eventually marry Charles Harris, and her future sister-in-law, Sarah Harris, who, of course, the month is about. Crandall School constitutes one of the most vibrant examples of women inspiring women that we have, I think, from the whole rich annals of American history. A connection between at least 4 different women occurs to set the school in motion. Mariah Davis, Sarah Harris, and Prudence Crandall and Mariah Stuart. So I have here a chart. I'm not good with these PowerPoint circle things, but I'm trying. I'll get better. And I'll get better if I stay on it too. All right. David Walker and Nat Turner are 2 very important black activists right in the 1831 time. David Walker, a writer and pamphleteer up in Boston. Nat Turner, the leader of a slave revolt in Virginia that was recently made into a movie with the provocative title, The Birth of a Nation. That because of the sexism of the director, another intersectionality moment, didn't get the attention it deserved. But that's another story. So anyway, they are both inspirations to a black woman in Boston, Mariah Stuart, who writes in The Liberator. But she can't do that unless the white editor is going to listen to her, and William Lloyd Garrison does that. Then her materials are published in the newspaper. Mariah Davis is reading that paper and gets the paper to Crandall. So it's quite an interesting intellectual chain there. All right. Very good. So, The Liberator was edited by William Lloyd Garrison, a very idealistic and energetic young white man, in 1831. I won't tell his whole story. If you want to ask me later, I can fill you in. And what he said was that he was going to advocate for the immediate abolition of slavery with no recompense to the slave owners for the loss of their property, which is what the more moderate abolitionists were arguing. And he said that's ridiculous. They've stolen something, right? Just think about it, right? You don't recompense the thief, right? It just doesn't make sense. So he said, I will publish this paper every week until slavery is ended. And he presumed that would mean until after he died, but he was rather glad to see that it finally did end. And so he folded the paper in December of 1865 at the end of the Civil War. His sons were disappointed, and they said, well, we'll start it under a new name, and that is still publishing. It's called The Nation, one of the most important left-wing newspapers in the United States still. So anyway, it was a magazine, yeah.
It's a news magazine.
It's a news magazine. It's on newsprint, but yeah, it's.
Not anymore. Not anymore.
Oh, really? Oh, that's true. That's true. Yes, I date
Recently
myself.
became glossy paper.
Yeah. All right. So, who is reading The Liberator? Well, in the first 3 years of The Liberator's existence, from 1831 to 1834, the majority of subscribers were free blacks. And there were a lot of people reading The Liberator in Norwich. And that included 3 folks right here, who I mentioned before, William Harris, the father. Frederick Olney became an agent, and Charles Harris was also an agent of The Liberator. So, that when you were an agent, it was kind of your job to make sure other people read it. We also have evidence that because there was still a high rate of illiteracy in the black community, that sections of Liberator were read aloud to community meetings. So even if you did not know how to read, you could still be getting The Liberator. There's a story from Wesleyan University of Amos Beeman, whose father was a minister there in Middletown. But Amos Beeman was trying to get some learning at Wesleyan, and he was forbidden, of course. But what they would do instead is someone who knew how to read would show up at a restaurant or a pub and just read the Liberator out loud. And he said we waited for that, and we would repeat it and memorize it. So indeed, and that had happened with David Walker's pamphlet that I mentioned before too. So, Mariah Davis, and on her tombstone, and Mariah Davis. And by the way, Protestants at that time pronounced Maria as Mariah so they would not be mistaken for Catholics. And no one said it was easy, to quote Audre Lorde. Anyway, Mariah Davis is buried right here in Norwich, and I'm blanking on the name of the cemetery now. It's a very prominent one in this. What is the name, Dale?
The Antic?
Yeah. The Antic, yeah.
No, the Antic.
The Antic, right. And anyway, she was a free black woman who was apparently very light-skinned. One of Crandall's family members described her as an octoroon, which was the language at that time for what percentage of your blood was believed to be African. But she had been living in Boston prior to her engagement to Charles Harris, and I'd love to know how they met. Unfortunately, we haven't perfected communication with the dead, so I don't have evidence of that yet, but I'm working on it. I mean, heck, probably Cambridge Analytica knows, right? Yes, okay. But Mariah then moved to Connecticut and took a job at Crandall School working as a servant, although Prudence preferred the term family help. Charles Harris's father, William Harris, had by that time become the Norwich agent for the Liberator. He assumed that duty as soon as Nat Turner's revolt was over. We have a list in the Liberator of who the agents are, so you can tell when they kind of come on board, and it was right after Nat Turner. Once Davis started working at Crandall's house, she had plenty of opportunities to observe the young teacher. She took the measure of Crandall's character. She plied Crandall with copies of the Liberator until Mariah felt confident enough to encourage her future sister-in-law, Sarah Harris, to formally approach the teacher. Mariah Davis thus wove a network between Prudence Crandall and 5 important radical sources: the abolitionist press and the Liberator, the radical intellectual currents of the free black community in Boston, the local free black community in Norwich and eastern Connecticut generally, and Mariah's own manifest intelligence. Crandall let her sit in on classes because she was clearly very smart, and probably that came in quite handy when she's trying to do the books to run a restaurant, is my guess. And finally, the eager desire of Sarah Harris to learn. Now, the next character here is, okay, I've said there's a lot of people reading it in Norwich. We have all these connections to the family, but what are they reading? What's the content? Well, the most significant content, I think, were the writings of Mariah Stuart. She was the very first American-born woman to give a public political speech in the United States. I have no idea why this fact isn't on everybody's tongue. It's so obvious that this is important. The only other woman who had given a political speech in the United States before was Fanny Wright, and she was from Scotland. She wasn't really an American. And so Mariah Stuart, first woman of any race from the United States to give a public political speech, and she gave it to what in those days was piquantly called a promiscuous audience, meaning that it had black and white men and women, kind of like you. So tonight, you are my promiscuous audience. The goal was, for her, was to try to rouse black women to do what they should, to scold black men for their laziness and not doing what they should, which is what eventually cost her speaking job. They didn't like being chided by a woman. And also to let the white community know what was what. As I like to say when I introduce my students to Mariah Stuart, the first woman to speak in the United States told the truth. Our track record since then has been mixed. But she really got it right. And among the things she says, and when people say, well, it says in the Bible women aren't supposed to speak, and she says, well, God at this eventful period is going to raise up females. He's done it before. Read the Bible more carefully. that there have been important women figures, and that we have every right to. She even tries to chide St. Paul, which I just love. She says, so Paul says we aren't supposed to speak up, but if Paul were here and saw what was going on with us, I'm sure he'd have no trouble with it. Which I've always interpreted as her saying, if Paul were here, I'd talk sense to him. So anyway, she's very bold, and this we know would have been in one of the copies that Crandall would have had, because 1832, it was September that Sarah Harris came to her, so July would have been a time when she's getting the copies of the Liberator. And so she says, many bright and intelligent ones are in the midst of us, but because they are not calculated to display a classical education, they hide their talents behind a napkin. So she sees the problem, which is that there isn't educational opportunities. So she's on that, and we know Crandall saw that. And then, in another thing that Crandall might have read, because it was in a pamphlet that the Liberator published by Stuart, she says, shall it any longer be said of the daughters of Africa, they have no ambition, they have no force? By no means. Let every female heart become united, and let us raise a fund ourselves, and at the end of 1.5 years, we might be able to lay the cornerstone for the building of a high school. That the higher branches of knowledge might be enjoyed by us, and God would raise us up in enough to aid us in our laudable designs. So it's very clear what Stuart is calling for here, the founding of a high school, which happens in nearby Canterbury. So, again, this particular one, I can't be 100% sure that she read it. I can be 100% sure that Mariah Davis would have read it, and that the Harrises would have read it. The Harris family would have had access to this. And so there is this inspiration and this open call. So, and let me just add too, that Mariah Davis took a real chance. She's got a radical newspaper, most of whose subscribers are African American. She's 18 or 19 years old. She's got a job, which she probably desperately needs before her marriage. And she's going to start giving this to her employer, who's white and who has authority. It was a remarkably brave thing to do. And we need to remember that, because it was the moment that changed the history. That at any, if Crandall hadn't taken that bait, but if Davis hadn't been brave enough to put it out there, we wouldn't be talking about this now. And I say that because, what Sarah Harris does next is so brave also, but she was prepared for it. She knew what she was doing, and I would draw a comparison there to Rosa Parks. Right? Rosa Parks didn't just one day say, oh, I'm tired. She'd been working with a group to investigate how best to change the segregation laws, the Jim Crow laws. And then she chose a day on which to act. And yeah, she was tired that day, but she'd been tired the 150 days before too. Right? And the same thing I think is true here with Sarah Harris. Sarah Harris had always wanted to gain an education. She was a smart woman, as her later life proves. But she wasn't, again, I think it just strains credulity to think that a black woman was just going to walk up to a white woman and say, will you take me? No, I don't think it was going to happen that way. Probably she had to have the fiscal permission of her father before she asked. But that's probably the only time that you have a kind of male influence in this story. That other than that, we really are looking at a moment of woman-to-woman contact of both ideas and personality. And this is a reason why I think Crandall remained so forward in her anti-racism, if I can just speak as a white person, grateful to her for starting us on this path, was that she had been brought over to the abolitionist movement not by the abstraction of the ideas, but by two actual women she knew. Mariah Davis, and then Sarah Harris had been visiting Davis sometimes at her, at the school. So Crandall knew them both. And I think that the depth of her commitment was about the fact that she knew actual people who were actually being hurt by the racial structures in America. So it gave her a very powerful and ongoing connection. All right. So, when when Sarah Harris asks, she says, I want to get a little more learning, if possible, enough to teach colored children. And if you will admit me to your school, I shall forever be under the greatest obligation to you. And that's not all Harris said. She also said, I don't want to be the cause of injury to you, which indicates something very important, which is that Sarah Harris knew what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And the fact that Crandall thought about it meant Crandall knew what was going to happen. They weren't lacking in the ability to extrapolate. And so anyway, when Harris asks, she doesn't ask just once. And this too is often overlooked because it's a better story if she asks once and Crandall sees. But in fact, what Crandall said later was her repeated solicitations were more than my feelings could resist. And I told her if I was injured on her account, I could bear it. She might enter as one of my pupils. So Sarah Harris was persistent. That was last year's meme, right?
Yeah.
She persisted. And that was important. So, as I mentioned here, she was an independent, Crandall became really an independent convert to the abolitionist cause. Even Samuel J. May, the great abolitionist who was just up in Brooklyn, Connecticut, he had not met Crandall prior to the crisis. So she didn't really know the abolitionists personally. Back to Mariah Stuart, another bit that Crandall might have read here was this one, where Stuart says, I've asked several individuals of my sex, and from context she means white women, who transact business for themselves, if providing our girls were to give them the most satisfactory references, they would not be willing to grant them an equal opportunity. Their reply has been, for their own part, they had no objection, but as it was not the custom were they to take them into their employ, they would be in danger of losing the public patronage. And such is the powerful force of prejudice. So it's, again, very clear that Stuart had sussed out what was really going on with racism, which is, oh, well, individually, I'm fine with everybody, but I'd lose customers. And so that's something that Sarah Harris might have had in mind when she said, I don't want to be an injury to you, but it's also something that Crandall could have been reacting to and just said, okay, we're going to go with it because someone has to break this down. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I can see I'm running a little out of time, but the advertisement that came out for Crandall's new school is one of the most profound documents in American history. It is not all that much talked about outside of Canterbury, but you can get a postcard of it at the museum, and I recommend you all do, and send it to your friends. First of all, the list of what was taught is a fairly ambitious list, including chemistry, astronomy, and moral philosophy, which was actually considered de rigueur at these schools. There is some evidence, by the way, that science was better taught at female academies than at male academies at this time, because the men were basically being taught to go back to the ancients, and the women were given the up-to-date stuff. So anyway, it may be that women were more advanced in chemistry than men were at that time. But what makes it revolutionary is who the people are who signed on. There's 15 endorsers, and 8 are black and 7 are white, as the most consistently integrated document I have found from the antebellum period. And they are not ordered by race. They are not defined by race. When I started on this project back in 2001, I didn't know who all these people were on this list. I had to discover a few of them, and that's when I understood just how integrated this was. But it doesn't give you any hint. It gives you their titles, a couple of reverends, a couple of esquires, but that's about it. And they're ordered by their location. They're also particularly young men, and so it's a kind of generational shift that was also being done there. Of course, we don't have a similar list of women. I've made up a pretend one that I like to play with, but it was men who were giving the endorsement. The important thing here, though, is that what were these black men endorsing? What they were doing was saying to black parents, it's safe. I know you've never heard of Canterbury in rural Connecticut, and there aren't a whole lot of blacks there, but this is okay. The black endorsers were putting a lot more on the line than the white endorsers. But in this, I think they were sharing their duties. The white endorsers could do the political upfront work. They could say, hey, we're abolitionists. We've got this Liberator newspaper. The black endorsers were saying, we've talked to Prudence Crandall, who, by the way, made a trip to New York City to meet these black ministers. Again, she's an unmarried white woman hanging out with black men. So that, you just know that that's the place for innuendo. And when what she is seeing is it's the place for collaboration. So anyway, the black endorsers are giving that kind of okay to the school. And I always put this slide up in case some of you have heard of people. And the ones that have the little daggers by them, we know something about them after the school. Those that don't, I really want more information, and some of them we still haven't found. So help me. Like J.K. Johnson, I know who she is, but I don't have a piece of paper to prove it. So anyway, I always put it up there in case. And of course, it's really annoying when you get someone who's got like the most common last name in the world, and first initials. It's like Emmy, it's probably Mary Elizabeth, but it could be something else. I don't know. Anyway, working on it. And as I said before, the students were not girls, and their average age was 15 and a half. They were not learning how to read. Most of them already knew that. They were learning, they were getting high school and junior high level, and the school was not a failure. The violence against the school was pretty much constant. I mentioned the legal violence already. I won't go into that again. But some of the vigilante violence included refusal of clean water, which was made worse if you threw cow dung into the well. Eggs and rocks thrown at the school. The teachers put one of the rocks up on the mantelpiece as a souvenir. Taunts, jeers, and noisemakers anytime any of the students were visible. And they kept on learning. And that's why, I've been so inspired by what's been going on with these students from Florida, because they're getting all of this hate mail. Their pictures are being warped on the internet, and what do? They're like, just gonna wake up and do it again. They shot my classmates, I'm gonna do it again. I'm just gonna go out there again. What's the worst that can happen? Exactly what happened to my classmates. I'm gonna just keep doing it. Right? And so that persistence is important. The students were refused medical attention, and there was an arson fire set, which I'm turning to in a moment. And in the only known fatality, a black and white cat was murdered. And skinned and its fur thrown over the fence in order to make a point. When I was writing that chapter, my late mother-in-law's cat, who later became my own after my mother-in-law died, Oreo, was sitting there. And I think it's because he knew. It's like, I'm here in solidarity. But, yeah, very good. One of the main areas where the students played an important role was in the various trials that happened because of the Black Law. There were 3 trials around the Black Law and a 4th trial having to do with a false arson charge against Frederick Olney. There's a lot of visual representation, and yet in that visual representation, we don't see the students, who were actually the ones who testified. Crandall never testified in court. Instead, it was 16-year-old young women, black women in an all-white, all-male courtroom who are testifying and who saved the day each time. Right. And again, I'm back to my love for Emma Perez, right? Which is that if we can't see, if it was today, that would be what was all over the media. But then in a very white-dominated culture, they couldn't even get that.
Isn't it Emma Gonzalez?
What's that? Emma Gonzalez, excuse me, yes. Yeah, no, I was thinking, Emma Gonzalez, thank you. But yeah, so where are they? They're not present. And so I have brought them to you today. Here they are. Sarah Harris, who you know. Very badly faded picture here of Mary Harris, with her name Mary Harris Williams. And these two, Maritza Lyons, very famous African-American writer who was the niece of one of the students, G.C. Marshall. And G.C. Marshall's sister, Mary Joseph Marshall Lyons. I love this picture, okay? It's like, I am so gloriously large, it's like, I love it. There's absolutely no shame there, She is so happy, to the extent that you were allowed to be happy in a 19th century picture. But yeah, she's not embarrassed. She's fine with it. Okay, so what happens is that there was an arson fire set at the school in January of 1834, late January of 1834. Frederick Olney was visiting the school that day, and he noticed there was a clock that wasn't working. He talked to Prudence about it, and then he went to talk to Charles and Mariah Harris. They had already married because they were hanging out in the kitchen. So he went there, and one of the students moved into the room and said, "Oh, I smell smoke." And she came back, and she went out to Olney, and Olney came in, and he immediately sensed where the fire was, put out the fire, saved the house. Like, wow, what a hero. Except that the authorities turned around and accused him of having set the fire. So what we have here is something that, in the 21st century we see again, the framing of a man of color, in order to both remove the label of hero and also to get him out of the scene. This was taken to trial in March of 1834. And at that trial, his alibi became very important, and his alibi is the sweetest alibi ever. The student who I mentioned here, we don't have her picture, Gloria Catherine Marshall. Actually, Gloriana, it's even better. Gloriana Catherine Marshall. Her mother lived in New York City, and her mother was sending her daughter a care package. Like, isn't that sweet? And she had tried to send her daughter a care package back in October, but it had never made it. And given the amount of hostility to the school, one can only imagine why. So this time she said to her good friend Frederick Olney, who was visiting New York City, so again we know he's plying the networks there, if he could deliver it. It took him only like 3 or 4 days to get from New York City up to Canterbury. In those days, that wasn't an easy journey. But he got up there, and he promised Elizabeth Marshall, Gloriana's mother, that he would send a letter as soon as he had given her the package so that she would know. So he did that. He gave Gloriana the package, posted the letter, then found out about the fire. So, to the trial comes Elizabeth Marshall with her daughter, Mary Joseph. And already the students had given good testimony, including Mary Harris, Sarah's younger sister. They had already given good testimony about how trustworthy Frederick Olney was, but then came Elizabeth Marshall, and she said, "I can't read. That's why I brought my daughter." And so she read the letter from Olney that confirmed his alibi, and the jury, an all-white, all-male jury, unanimously acquitted Frederick Olney. So that kind of heroism is remarkable, and yet it's been hidden, and it was hidden for a very stupid reason. The Library of Congress misfiled a newspaper from Brooklyn, Connecticut as being from Brooklyn, New York. So I just discovered this story about 2 years ago, and I'm not trying to be proud on myself here, it really was just an accident. But a woman who is a descendant of Mary Lyons was actually working on her own book, that being Carla Peterson. She spoke at the Crandall Symposium a few years ago, and I was able to give that to her as a gift. It's like, here's another very cool thing that your ancestors did, right? And, but that will show you what these students were doing and who they were and their power. And and now I have their pictures, I can put them back at the trial. I'm happy with that. So the mob violence. How did the students react to all of this? They reacted with nonviolence. This is a letter to the Liberator from one of the students. We don't know which one, because the Liberator, the white editors knew, protect these students' identities, right? So we don't know which student wrote it, but we as a body, my dear schoolmates, are subject to many trials and struggles, and we all know to what they are attributable. It is the prejudice the whites have against us that causes us to labor under so many disadvantages. They are so prejudiced against us that they will not suffer us to come up and be sharers in any of their privileges.
Wow.
Oh, prejudice, heaven grant thy reign may be short. My friends, although the white people may be so enraged against us as to try to break down every benevolent effort made in our behalf and put every obstacle they can in our way to prevent our progress, you are aware that ever since we have been under Miss Crandall's instructions, it has been her utmost care to persuade us not to indulge in angry feelings towards our enemies. With unceasing and untiring earnestness has she pled with us to forgive them And now let us try to abide by her counsel and feel at peace with all men. And I love this. I mean, I put Dr. King's spirit up there, because there is a great tradition of black nonviolence in this country, of which Dr. King is the most outstanding representative in our kind of iconic imagination. But the thing about nonviolence is it's not easy. Right? There's always a strain, because you really are angry. You're not motivated to act if you're not angry. If you're not feeling the unrighteousness. But that is all the more reason to be nonviolent, right? And that the students recognize that. And again, as teenage women, it's not like violence was an option for them. It's not like they had that as a live option. So I really appreciate that we have that testimony from them at the moment.
Whoops, you called her Perez.
I did again, yeah, no, I know, I what to say, brain freeze. But yeah, and I'm so glad too that Marjorie Stoneman Douglas's name is back out in the public, because she was an amazing activist for the environment, for the Everglades, just incredible. But yeah, be the change you wish to see in the world. So if you're going to grow up and be an adult, turns out you have to act like an adult. You have to already be that change, and that's what Sarah Harris did. That's what Mariah Davis did. That's what these students who were testifying did. And if you're going to address injustice, you're going to have to go further than people have gone before you. And finally, if you're going to seek an education, you have to already know a lot. In India, there's a wonderful tradition of this, that when it's time for you to pick your guru or your teacher, that's got to be your most educated decision of all. But for the student, that's the hardest decision, to find the right teacher. And so we're seeing that, and I think they would know each other. And as I said before, we judge education from its results, not its longevity. Canterbury was, in my mind, a resounding success. And I think that the students of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School are already a success. Again, you don't have to agree with their politics, but they've already done exactly what they said they were going to do, which is that the gun debate will be different after us. They said that the very first day. And I thought, oh wow, they already understand the history of what they're doing. They already understand it is history simply to be able to stand up and make that stance. And I think Sarah Harris knew that, and I think Mariah Davis knew that, because they were reading The Liberator. They understood the changes that were happening. And so if we can see that sometimes it is true that the youth teach us the story locally, and the story from the 1830s, and the story that is happening right now in our country are examples of that. And I thank you for your attention.
I want to thank all of you for coming. It was so generous of Jennifer to come in before the end of the academic year from California to Norwich to help us inaugurate Harris Sisters Month.
It's just wonderful that you're doing this.
My name is Alana Sherman, and I've organized this month in collaboration with Otis Library. Otis Library, which is such a shining star in the town, which represents the best and the heart of knowledge. So thank you to Otis Library, especially to Julie Menders.
Oh,
Thank you, Julie.
Came to us 2 years ago with this idea, so this really of creating this Harris Sisters Month. And we had some great programs last year. We had walking tours that Dale helped out with, and we had a live play here about Prudence Crandall and the students. And this year we have the wonderful artwork from the students. So when you get a chance, please be sure to take a look at this.
My teacher taught me.
Yes.
Is the name of the art exhibit.
And there's also a wonderful exhibit downstairs. Make sure you check it out on your way out. The display cases from the Prudence Crandall Museum.
So there are others I'd like to recognize. Of course, Dale Plummer, who has done so much to uncover Black history in Eastern Connecticut. And it was because of Dale who I met Jennifer. Jennifer was here about a year ago speaking. I want to acknowledge Faye Ringel, who is going to be our speaker next Saturday. Come on up for a second.
I wish I could be here. Oh, yeah.
And describe what you're going to be talking about.
Well, I'll be speaking about another teacher who also ran a school that has been denigrated in exactly the same way. Lydia Sigourney, who ran first two schools in Norwich that I'll be speaking about, one for girls and one Sunday school for local African American children, and then a girls' school in Hartford. And every single biography of her manages to say, oh, though they only lasted 1 year, 2 years, and so on. It was exactly the same kind of denigration that who knows where that influence ends. So I'll be but she in particular was written out of the early history of the American School for the Deaf, where she was one of the most instrumental founders. So I'll be speaking about those things. We'll be in the other room, in the story room, because there's something else going on in here. So
we're
busy.
going to be starting an advisory group, a Harris Sisters Month advisory group, and if you'd like to participate, please contact Julie, and Julie will get in touch with me. Every year in April, the month of the founding of the Black Academy and the month of Sarah Harris's birth, we're going to be doing programs that highlight the intertwining of education and liberation. And we want more participation, we want more ideas. So please be in touch with us if you'd like to participate. Are there questions for Jennifer? Yes.
How did you get interested in this particular story?
I had started to read some of Mariah Stuart's works that came to me in a variety of ways in the mid-90s, one through a dear friend and one through a philosopher who I liked a lot. And I had her words in my mind, and my mother lived in Connecticut at the time, and we were traveling around, and I saw about the school now being a museum, and I'm like, oh, I think you'd like that. It's an old house, and, see. And I just walked in, and Prudence, who did believe that you could talk to the dead, apparently grabbed me right by the collar and hasn't let me go. The thing that interested me originally, my home discipline is comparative religious studies, is that she went through a variety of religious changes in her life that kind of mirror the way stations that were available to white women at that time. So she started out as a birthright Quaker, and then she left the Quakers, as I like to say, just in time when they were becoming more quiescent than just quiet, and moved over to the Baptists, who at that time were far more active politically, part of the Second Great Awakening. But then when she married this Baptist preacher, things started to go a little sour with the absolutism of evangelical Christianity, and she ends up becoming a spiritualist. And then in her very last illness, she actually plays around with the Christian Scientists a bit. So I was fascinated by that spiritual pilgrimage, and that still is a part of the book. But I actually found when I came to religion within the school that it was really ecumenical, and that the students came from a variety of denominations, and the regulation simply said that you have to, for the school said you have to go to church somewhere on the Sabbath, but that was about it. So it was one of those early American models of kind of religion as a voluntary association.
And as I recall from my visit to the museum, the local church would not accept the girls. And
The local Congregational Church refused.
Yeah, and so she took them, was it to a Baptist church?
Yeah, it was her own Baptist church called Packerville Baptist, and the students were accepted there. I am deeply suspicious that there was a rift there where the minister was more willing than the man who was running it. The man who was running it was an industrialist, Daniel Packer, and Packerville started out as a kind of company town.
Wow.
And Packer himself was, I believe, Congregationalist, but he said, well, my workers want a Baptist church, so that's what I'll give them. But he still wanted control over that church, and I don't think he liked the additional publicity that was being generated. On the other hand, the minister was a remarkably talented revivalist who brought in over 300 people to that church, including Crandall, over about a 4-year period. And things were coming to a head where the minister was going to leave because I think he was getting too much flack, but unfortunately, the minister ended up dying instead, so. But he was remembered fondly even 50 years after his death. People still remembered him as one of the best ministers ever. So he was probably the one who was welcoming the students.
It would be very interesting, just because Congregationalism and the United Church of Christ are still such a potent
Oh, yeah.
force in this area.
Yeah.
I'd be really interested to know how they tell that story of excluding these young women from their church.
They're apologetic at this point. What was happening was actually a battle for prestige. The Congregational Church was in Canterbury was the center of the standing order, and they weren't going to put up with that kind of assault on their values. I think it's understood as a regrettable moment, and there was at least one congregational minister who came and went very quickly from that church, who, during the crisis, who was probably not as hostile to Crandall as the townspeople were.
You just used the term assault on their values. Really, it wasn't an assault on their status that they were afraid of?
Yeah, but they saw that as their values. Right, yeah, right. That their status was who they wanted to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we have to remember, we're only 15 years after the end of the establishment,
Right, exactly.
being the established church.
Yeah. So they were
It's
already in
still
a new
news.
situation. Yeah, they were already in a situation where they were fighting for market share when they previously had a monopoly.
Yeah.
So they really thought their prestige was part of who they were. They also believed in a picture of Christianity in which a hierarchic social order was a given. They saw that as part of the hierarchy that starts with God and then human beings below God, and so they just thought everything should be hierarchic, and social leveling was to them against God. Yeah, Dale, you had a question?
I'm just going to say in 1850, African Americans in Norwich had well over 90% literacy. So I have a feeling that in the 1830s, with public education being available
Yes.
to blacks, maybe not to the same extent, but also the African Sunday School at Second Congregational and so forth, that the community here was much more literate.
I would think so, yeah. I would think that they were for a variety of reasons, and I also would, I ended up not putting it into a slide, but David Ruggles' wonderful paean to his education here was about how strong the common schools were. And so I think that there was, and the Harris, everyone says that too, that the Harris family was fully literate, even if the father was sometimes, he hadn't been able to meet his own educational goals, but the children were all quite literate, yeah. So I think you're probably right. There was probably higher here than, say, in New Haven or Hartford for the literacy of the black population. Anything else? Okay.
Thank you,
Well,
Jennifer.
thank you so much. Oh, good. No, I could see that. I looked over and saw her attending this.
Wow. Well, of course, it's
Yes, please.
because it's in the sun.